Hi, I'm here with State Senator David Zuckerman and Representative Carolyn Partridge, and we're here celebrating yesterday's victory of passing the first state laws requiring labeling of GMOs. So first of all, congratulations. It was an incredible victory. We're celebrating here in Iowa. We're celebrating around the United States. In fact, the entire world is celebrating. How are you feeling? I know it's been a long, long time, a long road to get here.
Well, I'm feeling elated, actually. The vote was very strong on the floor of the House. It was 114 to 30. I felt that we really, this was the end of several years of work. David and I have been working on GE labeling for a long time, back into the early 2000s. And so this was sort of the culmination of just years and years of work. The House worked on it in 2012. We brought together a bill that was pretty darn good. We did it again last year, and then the Senate improved the bill, I think, and I think we've come up with a really good, strong, defensible product.
No, I would agree. It feels great. And Jeffrey, as you know, you came to Vermont over a decade ago. We started working on various GE policy, and to have worked on something this long, it's almost impossible to express how it feels, having sort of finally gotten over a major threshold. And as you know, obviously across the country, we haven't quite been able to crack that nut, whether it was through the referendums out west or because of the trigger clauses in some of the states back east. So it's a tremendous day. I was sitting in the gallery of the House when they voted yesterday, and it really, one of the things that's amazing, particularly in the House, which often will break down into very partisan lines on major issues, there were a good 10 or 15 Republicans that also voted for this bill, and it just shows how the public support was so strong that across party lines there was support.
Yeah, I actually want to follow up on that and thank in particular all of the Vermonters who weighed in with us 2 years ago when we held a hearing, April of 2012. There were 350 or 400 people who showed up in an evening hearing one Thursday night to express their support for this. And I want to thank them all. They were a little bit saddened that at the end of 2012 when we weren't able to move it along, but their input really made a difference.
Yeah. Fantastic. And I totally warmly remember visiting there in 2003. Dave, I stayed in your living room floor.
Sorry, I didn't have a guest room.
there was a mattress. And Carolyn, we met when I spoke with the Agriculture Committee there, and then I testified. I think I testified by Skype from Vietnam one year, and I testified from out west one year. Yeah, we've been working. I've been watching and rooting for you and doing what we can here for a long time, and you guys were the first. You passed the first state regulation on GMOs back more than a decade ago for requiring labeling of seeds.
That's
right.
And then you worked on the next one where it was going to be...
it was the Farmer Protection Act.
Farmer Protection Act.
Making the companies carry the responsibility for their own seed. And we passed it, as you know, and unfortunately the governor at the time vetoed it. So I think, but I have to say, I think those efforts helped pave the way for this legislation, because unlike California and Washington, where some of the other sides, I would argue propaganda or misinformation, persuaded and scared some people around this kind of thing, in Vermont, the average person has heard about GMOs much longer. They've heard some of those spooky fear tactics of much more expensive food, or they're going to feed the world, and we had already dispelled those myths, and so over the last 10 years. And so I think because of that, we were in a much stronger position to move this bill forward. And I just want to point out, I recognize that there was tremendous support for this across the country, and folks who are maybe seeing this were thinking, why didn't I get alerts the way that we did in California and Washington to help? And actually myself and others actually asked to keep it a little bit down low, not because we didn't want to hear the support, but because our computer systems in the state of Vermont aren't that big. We've got 200,000 emails. First of all, many of our colleagues would have been upset because they wouldn't have been able to find their own constituent emails amongst them. And second of all, we might have crashed the system. And my telling other legislators that that was out there had some effect with some of the senators. They were very thankful that groups out there were helpful, but were cautious in how they did their health. It was very perfect.
Yeah.
So tell us, what was the opposition, and the opposition from your colleagues in the House and Senate, and also I would love for you to paint the picture of what the biotech lobbyists looked like. What did they say? Did they approach you, or did they just give up on you and just approach others because they knew you were basically sold for the legislation?
You know, it was interesting. I think that I would say a good percentage of the people who voted against it yesterday felt compelled to explain their votes. And the reasons that they gave was basically that, why should we make 80% of the people who supply food to our supermarkets label their food? Why don't we get the people who are GE free or GMO free? Why don't we get that 15 or 20% to label? So there was a sense that, you know, we're going about this the wrong way. And I think everybody in this room gets why we wanted the 80% to label, and the fact that, you know, 64 other countries label already is not going to mean a huge hardship to the manufacturers. And so, you know, that was the major reason given, that, you know, we were, you know, yeah, we want people to know what's in their food, but that we were just making this large people label when a much smaller group should have to bear that burden.
The other argument that was made by some would be the legal risk to the state, because I think it's pretty clear that there's a likely lawsuit from either the Grocery Manufacturers Association, that's the likely culprit. It might be the biotech industry, but you know, Vermont is a small state, and the cost of a lawsuit is not insignificant. Obviously, if we lose, the cost could be quite a bit more. And so, you know, some of the opposition was concerned in that regard. Many of us felt that if we weren't to pass laws because corporations threaten to sue, that's also a very bad precedent to set, because our job is to make laws based on what we believe is constitutionally okay and based on what our constituents want. And so I would say those were a couple. And the other thing is, many of those folks that explained their vote almost felt they had to do it because they'd heard from so many constituents that they should be supporting it, that they were almost explaining their vote to their constituents. I know you all pleaded with me to vote yes. I'm really sorry. Here's why I voted no. Because they had to sort of do a little CYA.
Yeah. And the other thing, your question about what do the biotech lobbyists look like, I really didn't see too many of them here.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting, I met with some biotech lobbyists when I was at an agricultural leaders summit in January, and they just shook their heads about Vermont because they really knew they were already so far behind the eight ball from all three of our work and hundreds of other people's work over the last decade. And they were around. I saw some of the folks talking. They were mostly contract lobbyists for the people we already know in this building. And they talked with a few members to try to poke little holes here and there, but for the most part, they really didn't put all their eggs into Vermont. I think they already wrote it off that we were on our way.
I think one of the important things to keep in mind too is, and this is something the Senate did, and I'm really glad they did, we were able to concur with this, was the creation of the special fund, so that if people around the country, around the world, want to contribute to this fund when it's created, I believe it goes into effect on July 1st, 2014, they will be able to help. You know, if we are taking, I think it looks, frankly, I think it looks bad for someone to sue us for wanting the right to know what's in our food. I think that's really, really bad public relations, but you just never know.
Well, and that's why they're going to sue as an association, because an individual company, if they sued, then there would be a national headline saying, Company X is suing because they don't want to tell you what's in their food.
Yeah.
But it's under the cloak of an association, just like the grocery manufacturers gave all that money in Washington State, and the Attorney General of Washington State was suing them to get disclosure on who those companies were. I think that same issue is going to be the case with the lawsuit.
You know, Carolyn, I did not know about the fund, but I don't know if you remember that when I testified last, I said, do you want me to create a fund? Do you want me to raise money for Vermont? We'll be happy to do that so that you'll have more boldness to pass a law, so that we'll know you'll have a lot of money pledged from people all over the world. So I don't know if that idea originated from that testimony or not, but I'm thrilled that you're doing that as a crowdfunding opportunity. It's amazing, great for a state to do crowdfunding to defend itself against Monsanto.
So, I do remember your testimony, and it did enter my brain, but it was not something we included in our bill. But the Senate had the wisdom to do it.
Well, it was interesting because my whole sort of line in the sand here in the Senate was that we would not pass a law that had a trigger mechanism that gave up our state's autonomy to other state legislatures. Yeah. And I said to leadership, if you're going to pass a GMO bill, you need to know that I will be voting against it if it ends up with that kind of trigger. And thankfully, from work over the years, every legislator has different things they've worked on a lot. That kind of put a pretty firm line because people knew if I was going to vote no, a lot of supporters for the bill would be concerned about that and would give leadership or other colleagues some grief. But then I also had to think of, okay, what is some sort of threshold or what is some kind of scenario that my colleagues who are concerned about a lawsuit would feel comfortable about? And at first I said, well, why don't we make a trigger be a fund, and when it reaches a certain threshold, that's when the law would go into effect. And in further retrospective thought, we decided that was a bad idea because we didn't want to set a precedent where a state law would wait to go into effect until some interest put in enough money to a fund. That's also a bad precedent. Mm-hmm. But I think that morphed into, okay, we have state funds and government all over the place. They all are open to accepting public monies and gifts and other things. We'll do it under that framework, and of course welcome organizations like yours and your work. There are other people who have expressed interest, and so maybe there will be either a collaborative effort across the country or somehow direct people to help, and that's a wonderful thing, but it's also not a precedent-setting thing because we have many other funds just like it.
Beautiful. And your bill has a prohibition on labeling a product natural if it contains GMOs. So was that a no-brainer for you, or was that something that had a lot of discussion, and was there a big opposition to that?
That was something that was in the House draft of the bill, and that was something that people were actually very surprised at, that you could label a product natural when it had GE components. So that actually was kind of a no-brainer for a lot of my committee, even the folks that ended up voting against it.
Yeah, we barely even talked about it. We saw that language and left it right in there as it was. And I'd say that's true for a lot of language that the House committee put together. They really structured a very solid bill to start with. And I would say the work we did was really touching some things around the edges, adjusting the date because we're a year later, and that fund idea. But really the main basis of the bill originated out of the House from really good work over there.
One thing I would like to add, when we passed the bill out of the House, we had two potential dates. We had either 18 months after two other states passed similar language, and we also had a drop-dead date of July 1st, 2015. And I will say that if others are thinking about strategy, that did actually give some members comfort in order to and help bring folks along to vote for the bill originally in 2013.
Still a slightly different trigger than some of those other states, though, because they still have the drop dead date. That was more of a date to move it earlier, not implementation language.
That's exactly right. But we did have the 2 years on there to give people the opportunity to change their packaging, to reformulate their product. But if others are thinking about this, that may be a strategy that they might think about using. But I will say that in 2012, when we took testimony, we had testimony from an attorney at Washington firm representing Bio. And she told us that regardless of a trigger date or not, that once this was in, once we had passed it, we would potentially be sued. And they would consider it an imminent threat under the concept of ripeness, and they would sue us. So, the trigger really technically doesn't mean anything, but then by the same token, in Maine and Connecticut, they've passed bills with triggers, and I don't understand that they're being sued.
I haven't heard that they are yet. We did also learn from the Attorney General's office and others that states that put in trigger clauses that are required to wait for other states or the states implement it at the same time, there's nothing that doesn't give any further protection to an individual state.
Right.
The folks out there can choose to sue one state. They're not required to sue them all. So one of the reasons states did put in triggers was to think, oh, well, we would collectively bear the cost of defending this. And that's actually a false thought, that an individual state could be sued anyway. And that's one of the ways we actually moved away from it as well. The Judiciary Committee said, well, there's no point in hanging ourselves on with other states if it actually doesn't give us any further legal protection.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And we're going to wrap up here. I want to ask a couple more questions. What was the reaction of your constituents after the vote passed? What have you been hearing? That must be fun.
I think I'm positive, really.
Yeah. You know, there have been 2 times on the floor of the House when clapping and a cry of joy went up. One time was after we passed civil unions back in 2000, and the other time was yesterday. Wow. And of course, we don't allow that on the floor of the House. There's no expression of emotion one way or the other. But the Speaker had to gavel people down. So I will say that it was pretty remarkable. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, this is the breaking news. The headlines are, for the first time since civil unions were passed, sounds of joy erupted in the halls of the House. Now, let me be clear about, for those listening, exactly what this is. We're going to require labeling for products that use GMOs. It's not going to require labeling for milk or meat of animals that have been fed GMOs, but if products contain GMOs, it will require. Is there any threshold, or what is the means by which a corporation can choose not to? Is it have a
0.9%?
Okay. And 0.9% is the same percentage in Europe that requires a label, and it's also the same percentage of the non-GMO project for their what they call action threshold. So this is a harmonized with the non-GMO project and with Europe. It also requires that if a product has GMOs and does not meet the labeling restriction, and it has to be labeled, it can't also then say natural or 100% natural.
Correct.
And is there and it'll go into effect starting July 1st, 2016.
For consumers, it will go into effect that the products will be on the shelf labeled at that time. The law goes into effect earlier than that because we have rules and machinations that the state has to go through to make sure we give clear information as to what those labels are going to require, etc. So the Attorney General will be starting right away with those things being finalized in about a year.
And doesn't the fund go into it, because we could potentially...
And the fund goes into effect right away. Yeah.
All right, so people can we'll link to the fund from our site. People can go to responsibletechnology.org, and we'll give you an opportunity to link to the fund and also give you updates at the same time about whether there's a lawsuit or not. So some people think, they haven't thought this through, and they think, well, if it happens in Vermont, maybe other states will get it, and eventually my state will have it, and I'll have labeling too. Here's the answer. If a national brand is sold in Vermont, then it is likely that they were going to make a change nationwide.
Maybe. I would say that most of these companies have regional packing facilities, so they may or may not label something nationwide, but probably regionally they would. But also, once we've done it regionally, once they've chosen to label their products or follow the law, I think the argument of how difficult it would be or how much the cost would go up, which are not true, I think those things would go away pretty quickly, and that will hopefully make it a lot easier in other states.
Well, I have a question. If someone if making a product in California that doesn't comply with Vermont labeling, there's a risk that it may end up sold in Vermont. So they may have to figure out if that's worth the risk. I don't know if there's precedence there as well. But that's an interesting question.
Well, if there are violations, typically our Attorney General, in Vermont we handle things in a fairly common sense methodology. And the first thing that they would get is someone would have to complain. That's the first thing. It's a consumer protection law. The second part is the Attorney General would send a letter to that company saying, are you aware that you're in violation of this law? And could you please send us a letter as to how you would address this? And so the strict penalties and fines Vermont is not a state where we say, oh, you've made a mistake, you're going to get the full barrel of the opportunity here thrown at you. So companies that make a mistake are going to have time to remedy those mistakes. And that's sort of a Vermont way of doing things.
All right, that makes sense. So then if they choose to label their products as containing GMOs, then they face the potential where 53% of Americans say they would avoid GMOs if labeled. 39% of Americans say already that they're trying to avoid or reduce GMOs. So some of these companies may eliminate GMOs rather than admit that they use them. And if they do that regionally, they certainly may do that nationwide, especially when there's expected at least 26 other states that will be introducing bills this year and 2 others with ballot initiatives.
Yeah, and Ben & Jerry's, for instance, is on the road. They had hoped to be and the label is going to not say GMO. It's going to reference genetic engineering. This food may be produced, or this food is produced with genetic engineering. But Ben & Jerry's, for instance, which does, they do sell worldwide, they had hoped to reformulate their products so that nothing would have to be labeled. I don't know if they've made that goal, but some products I think are labeled without right now. And they're on their way to not having to label.
I think, that's a free market decision that every business and entity out there is going to have to make that decision. And again, we've learned as politicians, there are polls that show certain things. And depending on if there's cost differences, people say all kinds of things and then they go to buy organic or whatnot and they realize it is a different expense. So there's lots of factors that can influence those polls, but there's no doubt that there's large consumer sentiment to know what's in their food so that they can make that judgment each and every time looking at 3 different boxes of products. And each time they might make a decision one way or the other, but in aggregate across the country or across Vermont, there will probably be an effect, and those businesses will have to make a market decision as to what they want to do.
Now we are seeing a tipping point. We created a tipping point in the natural food industry where use of GM ingredients is a clear marketing liability. And we have some test cases out there like Ben & Jerry's and Smart Balance coming, and called the original product of Cheerios and for grape nuts. So we're going to see if it creates a tipping point in the conventional sector as well. So to finish up, I think that what we're looking at in terms of the immediate future is the potential for a lawsuit. We're also looking at the possibility of the FDA preempting states' rights for requiring labeling and saying we don't want a patchwork and we'll do it ourselves, and then they can mothball it for years. So hopefully the FDA will take the side of consumers and not take the side of the biotech industry. We'll have to see.
On that one, I'd have to say one of President Obama's initial pledges when he was running for office 7 years ago, or 6 or 7 years ago, I believe, was to label GMO food.
That's right.
So while Congress may have some actions that they've attempted to, and thankfully our senators and others have thwarted them in the Senate, I know there's a bill in the House, but thankfully it's not by a very successful representative, to thwart state labeling rights. I would certainly be extremely disappointed if under the Obama administration the FDA made that kind of decision. That would clearly be a 100% breaking of one of his campaign promises from 7 years ago. And so I would expect there to be quite a bit of outrage if that were to happen.
Yeah. And we will work with you to create that outrage if it does. All right. Anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
No, I'd just like to thank you for your support, Jeffrey. And I have to say, Genetic Roulette has been my Bible for the last few years. And to be honest with you, Seeds of Deception several years ago got us going on this. So, I mean, it was a combined effort, but we really appreciate everything you did to help out.
My pleasure. And I got to say that Vermont has been the leader for all of these years. The first state regulation on GMOs, the first state to require labeling. And when I hear you talk, you have a powerful case of democracy. You are really, it is contagious, it is exciting. You listen to what is right, not what the mechanics are for being sued or corporations. You come back to what is right, what is constitutional, what it means to be a citizen, and that is so inspiring for all of us. And I hope that this particular interview goes around the world so people can gain more confidence in the political system by virtue of what you've done.
Yeah, it just takes patience. Patience.
Well, and by many, many people. And again, it's one of those scenarios where citizens' actions can overpower the corporate influence in politics. And thankfully in Vermont, we're probably better situated for that than some of the bigger states. But there's a lot of states in Vermont where people still have a voice, and I hope they continue to use it.
Yeah, I call it proactive patience. Actually, I was friendly with Pete Seeger, and he had conversations with me, and really just taught me that if we keep working at it, if we keep just keeping our shoulders to the wheel, that we can make a difference. So I call it proactive patience.
Certainly.
And in the words of Pete Seeger, we shall overcome, and we are.
Yes.
Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care.